Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more Automation, the car company tycoon game. Continuing on with the campaign roleplay of the Edison Car Company in 2011. And the model we're going to be looking at in this video is the Edison Constellation, which is the large flagship sedan in the Edison Car Company lineup. Starting off with the base trim for the Constellation model. Let's take a look at the chassis. So this is a monocoque chassis made out of AHS steel, front longitudinal engine placement, double wishbone suspension up front and in the rear, and the panel material is made out of corrosion-resistant steel. As far as the styling goes, I'll give you a little bit of a 360 look at Constellation. And I've tried to go with a return to some of the chrome look as well as far as the styling goes and some of the appointments. As far as the drive type for this trim, it's a longitudinal rear-wheel drive. And the engine we're going to be using is the same engine that we had in the Star. As I said, every model outside of the Shooting Star and the Comet will be using this engine, but this does have a separate variant from the one we used in the Star. So this is the variant we used in the Star. The CNA6 is the one that we use in the Constellation. So there are some changes. So this is a V6 with aluminum silicone block and head. Displacement comes out at 3.2 liters. It has a dual overhead cam with 4 valves per cylinder and VVL. It has a forged steel crank, I-beam steel conrod, and lightweight forged piston. Compression comes up to 11.5, cam profile at 33, and VVL profile at 59, and this has VVT on all cams. This is a naturally aspirated engine and has direct fuel injection with a twin throttle setup. This has a standard intake and uses premium fuel. Fuel mixture is set at 15, ignition timing at 45, and RPM limit is set at 7,900. Use short cast headers with a dual exhaust setup, 2-inch diameter for the exhaust, 3-way cat, and 2 reverse flow mufflers to keep that noise nice and low. The end result of all of that is 252 horsepower and 214 foot-pounds of torque. Now, a big element of the design of the Constellation is making it comfort-oriented, and that is what I chiefly strive for when I am making this model, and that is why we have, for instance, more mufflers trying to keep that noise down, and also the double wishbone suspension in both front and rear for an increase in comfort. Moving on to the gearbox setup, I have a 7-speed automatic, which is an upgrade over the previous models we've seen so far, the Luna and Star, which had a 6-speed automatic. And the 6th and 7th gear are set up to go beyond that estimated top speed for increased fuel economy. The end result of that is 25.4 miles per gallon, a 0 to 62 time of 7.4 seconds, and we do have a little bit of wheel spin at 5.1%. The tire setup, we have medium compound road tires on 18-inch rims with 235 millimeter tire width both in front and rear, and alloy rim material. And I went with this style of rim as I felt like that went with more of the luxury look that I was going for with this model. I do have a little bit of rim offset to fill out the chassis. And for the brakes, I have solid disc 2-piston up front and solid disc 1-piston in the rear. For the aerodynamic setup, I have a fully clad under tray, and the cooling airflow is set to be roughly 10 above the required cooling. The interior has 5 seats, standard interior and standard entertainment, as this is the standard trim. Power steering, ABS, traction control, and electronic stability control are standard. As I stated in my previous videos, this is required by law for 2011 model years, so that is why they are standard. Safety is standard 2000s. For the suspension, I have progressive springs, adaptive dampers, and passive sway bars, and this is my overall suspension setup. Let's jump into the test track where we have a top speed of 161.2 miles an hour, a weight just below 4,000 pounds, and weight distribution is a little front heavy, but pretty close to evenly distributed. considering that that engine is up front. And for cornering Gs, not too bad. I think this is one of the better results we've seen thus far. And our acceleration time of 0 to 62 in 7.4 seconds, I expect a pretty decent time. And the time we end up with is 1 minute 32.55. Let's take a look at the next trim, where we have the addition of an all-wheel drive system as stated in the name. So this is the V6 standard trim with the addition of that all-wheel drive, which we will see added on to pretty much every other trim. So the premium trim is going to have all-wheel drive, and both of the V8 trims are also going to have all-wheel drive from here on out. So taking a look at the gearbox setup, the power distribution is set to be 30-70, so 30% of the power is going to the front and 70% to the rear. But otherwise, the gearbox is set up roughly the same, but because of that power distribution, we have more traction and we are able to get rid of the wheel spin. But as a consequence, we have a reduced 0 to 62 time and a reduced fuel economy of 25 miles per gallon. Tire setup remains the same, as does the brake setup, the aerodynamic setup, the interior setup, because largely the main difference is that addition of the all-wheel drive system. So there's probably going to be some slight differences here with the suspension setup because of an increase in weight, which we'll see once we jump into the test track. So our top speed is now 157.5 miles an hour, so that's dipped down. And our weight is now over 4,100 pounds. Weight distribution is a little bit more front heavy, if I recall, but not too big of a difference. And I also notice a little bit of a drop in cornering G. Now, considering that we've lost performance in a lot of areas, I think we can expect that the track performance we're going to get here is going to be slower for sure. And that is indeed what we see. So we lose more than a second with 1 minute 33.78 compared to our previous time. And jumping into the last trim for the V6, we have the premium trim. Now this is also going to remain largely the same, but it's going to have the addition of a number of things in the interior setup. But I thought I'd start from the gearbox so you can see some of the changes. So the gearbox is set up roughly the same. But because of a lot of that increase in weight, we are now seeing a reduction in fuel economy of 21.9 miles per gallon and a 0 to 62 time of 8.2 seconds. The tire setup remains the same. The brake setup, we have a little bit of a difference here as I've switched to a vented disc up front to reduce brake fade significantly. Cooling airflow remains the same. Interior is where we see part of the changes. So we have premium interior and premium infotainment system being added on, but with no other changes. But that is going to add on a decent amount of weight. But we also have one other change, and that is in the suspension. So we had progressive springs in the standard trims, and with the premium trim, I have a switch to the active comfort springs. So this is going to change a lot of the setup over here as a result. So you're going to see quite a bit of variance between the two. So let's take a look at the test track. So we've gone down still more with the top speed of now 156.8 miles an hour. Weight has continued to go up with now over 4,300 pounds. Whereas weight distribution has actually improved from the previous trim as we are more evenly distributing that weight. And our cornering Gs also look like they continue to have gone down as that weight has increased. Again, I think it's safe to say that this is going to be still slower because we have a reduction in several of the stats that will hurt our track performance. And again, that is indeed the result. So we have 1 minute 35.06 over the previous all-wheel drive V6 trim with the standard setup of 1 minute 33.78. All right, let's now jump into the V8, starting with the standard trim. Now, as I said, this is also going to be using an all-wheel drive system. So, again, we have a 30-70 power distribution, 7-speed automatic, set up roughly the same, although there's going to be differences because this is a more powerful engine. So the 0 to 62 time that we get is at 6.5 seconds, and the fuel economy is at 20.6 miles per gallon. Tire setup remains the same, as does the brake setup. We're definitely seeing more brake fade as we have increased weight and the power or top speeds that the vehicle will achieve, so more demands on those brakes. For the aerodynamic setup, we have an increase in required cooling, so we have to adjust the cooling airflow to match. So again, I have roughly 10 above what's required. For the interior, this is going to be the same setup as we saw in the standard trim. And we're going to see also with the springs, dampers, and sway bars that is also the same as the standard trims and not like the premium trim we saw previously. And this is the overall suspension setup, which is going to be slightly tweaked from the other standard trims because of that heavier V8 being added in. And taking a look at the test track, we now have a top speed of 174.1 miles an hour. Weight is over 4,300 pounds, and we're much front heavier because of that heavy V8 up front. 0 to 62 time is 6.5 seconds, and corner G's continue to drop with that increase in weight and that more front heavy weight distribution. But I'm pretty sure this is going to be overall a quicker track time than we've seen in the past, and that is what we see with 1 minute 30.30. So jumping into our final trim, which is the premium version of the V8 powered Constellation. So starting off with the gearbox setup, this is set up roughly the same as what we saw with the other V8 trim, although we do have reduction in fuel economy as well as 0 to 62 time due to increase in weight. Tire setup remains the same. Brake setup, actually, I should have selected vented discs, so we'll remedy that now to correspond with the other premium trim or match what the other premium trim does. The cooling airflow remains the same as what we saw with the other V8 trim, and the interior setup is the same as what we saw with the previous premium trim, so premium interior and premium infotainment being added in. The suspension also is like what we saw with the other premium trim, switching to active comfort from the progressive springs, and this is the overall suspension setup that I have for the V8 trim, which is going to be slightly different than what we saw with the V6 premium trim because of a difference in weight. And jumping into the test track here, we have 172.5 miles an hour for our top speed. Weight comes in at 4,600 pounds, almost even. Weight distribution is not quite as front heavy as we saw with the other V8 trim, but still more front heavy than what we saw with the V6 premium trim. Corning G's continue to go down because of that increase in weight. And I don't think we'll be too surprised to see a slower track time than we saw with our other V8 trim. And we see 1 minute 31.37. Now that does remain better time than what we got with the base trim with the V6, but definite drop in performance of close to a second from the standard V8 trim. Let's take a look at the project setup. So this has more of a learning focus than our previous models, as this being our flagship sedan is using higher tech, and I think it is appropriate to have more of that focus with it. Moving on to the factory setup, I have a large factory, which is my usual standard, and we're producing 494 cars per day. Now, as far as how I distributed the production of the different trims, I wasn't too sure, but I tried to stick with the same kind of idea that I used with the Star. So I figured that the V6 premium trim would be the most popular. It has a lot of features people would be looking for: all-wheel drive, more premium setup, optioned out setup that has become popular in this time period. And as a result, I figured that the V8 premium would be close behind that. And then more or less the different standard trims I put very close together because I wasn't really sure which one would be more popular than another. As far as the factory setup goes, though, I have the automation set at 80, and I kept the shifts to 2. For the engine setup, for which engine is this? The V6. I have a large factory, And the automation is set at 80. And to match the required engines with how many we're producing, at least producing more than required, I have the shift set to 1.3. And for the V8s, I have a medium factory, as we don't need quite as many of these, as there are less trims that use the V8. And as a result, I have, again, automation set at 80, but now I have to increase the shifts to 2.8 to get those production numbers up. But if I had switched to a large factory, I would be overproducing how many engines we needed. So that is kind of a compromise you have to make. Jumping into the market data, and we're going to start off with the V8 premium trim, as that was what I had selected before we went into the market data. The three market segments we're doing the strongest in are the Family Sport Premium, Fun Premium, and Muscle Car segment. Now, I'm not too surprised that we're doing well in the Muscle Car segment, and it's honestly our strongest segment. Not really what we were going for, but not too surprising. Now, honestly, with this vehicle, we're more looking for, obviously, the premium market segments. I would say Family Premium, and I guess Family Sport Premium, especially with the V8, that makes sense. And the Fun Premium, again, I would say makes sense with the fact that we have the V8. But I would say for the most part, we're looking at these three market segments. But we're not doing quite as strongly in the Family Premium segment as I think I probably would like. We're doing pretty well in the City Premium segment. Again, not something we were necessarily going for, but it's a bonus for sure to see that. The price ends up at over $25,000 with a 5% markup. And if we now jump into the standard or base trim with the standard trim in the V6, we'll see our lowest price point at a little over $17,000. And the market segments we're hitting now are a little bit different, with the Family Sport segment, the Pony segment, and the Sports Budget segment, the Sports Budget segment being our strongest. We're doing well in the Muscle Car segment yet again, as well as this row of market segments. The Commuter and Family market segment being the ones that we're really trying to do well in. These other market segments that we're really doing strongly in are not really our primary focus. Family Sport, I think, is okay because we're still hitting that family market segment a little bit. But these are the two market segments that I think, with this trim in particular, we're more focusing on. And we do well in those market segments, but maybe we could have done better. Now, obviously, we're not doing as well in the premium market segments here, but we're still getting over 100 in the competitiveness, so I consider that a decent result. Switching over to the all-wheel drive trim, we have an increase in price of $17,640 now, and we're still doing well in pretty much the same market segments, so Family Sport, Pony, and Sports Budget. Still doing well in the Muscle Car segment, and doing well in this top row, minus the Fun market segment, has dropped down a little bit. But again, our primary focus here is on the Commuter and Family market segments. Now, moving on to the Premium market segment, our priorities are going to change. We're going to want to do better in those premium categories like we did with our V8 premium trim. So now we've switched to Utility Sport, Muscle, and Sports Budget as our strongest market segments. Now, Sports Budget is a segment we were doing well in before. And honestly, I think this is a shift that we really weren't looking for. For instance, Utility Sport, we're not really looking to do well in this segment. I mean, it's a bonus to do well in market segments you're not really looking to perform well in. But we have other models that are really designed to do well in this market segment, not the Constellation. What we're really looking for is doing well in this row of market segments. Now, we do well, just not quite as well as these other market segments. I mean, honestly, over 120 is pretty darn good performance. It just, because they're not quite as good as these other performances, they're not being as highlighted as strongly. And the one that we do see highlighted is this Family Sport Premium, which, considering that we did well in the Family Sport segment before, which we continue to do well in, I don't think that's too surprising to see that. We're still doing over 100 in the Family segment and the Commuter segment, but they're definitely starting to drop down because of reduction and affordability. As we can see, the price has now risen up to over $21,000. The last trim we have to look at is the standard V8 trim, which is doing well in the light sport market segment, the muscle car segment, and the sport budget market segment. So it seems like we did well in a lot of the trims that we looked at in the sport budget segment. And some of them did well in the muscle car segment, but mostly just the V8 ones, whereas the V6 ones tended to do better in the pony car segment. Again, we're trying to look for, I would say, the family and commuter segment, this top row. And we're not doing quite as well, and I think a lot of that is due to an increase in cost, which we see here, almost reaching $22,000, actually eclipsing, from what I remember, the V6 premium cost, which is really honestly not something we want to see. But we continue to do well in the family sport segment, and we're starting to do well in some of these premium segments that we previously were not doing as well in with the other standard trims. So let's go ahead and get a comparison with the other models we've built so far. So that would be the Luna and Star. So from a drivability standpoint, I would say we match or exceed the performance for the most part of the Star, with the only real low point being the non-all-wheel drive trim here. So again, like to like, technically speaking, the Constellation doesn't do quite as strongly as the Star does, because the Star doesn't need all-wheel drive to get this better drivability numbers. As far as sportiness goes, this is a stronger performer, which I think makes sense considering that we have more of a rear-wheel drive setup, and for instance in the base trim, and we have more power on tap overall. As far as comfort goes, it's no surprise that this is one of the strongest performers, or it probably will be the strongest performer, as we built it specifically for that, with our highest numbers coming up to 49, almost reaching 50, which is very good. Prestige, again, no surprise, this is a strong performer here, with our weakest performance exceeding the strongest performance we see with the Star. 27, actually no, that's not true. 27 does exceed a couple of our trims, but for the most part, we're exceeding what we see with the Star. Safety here, again, no surprise, is at its is the highest so far out of the different models, and a lot of that has to do with the increase in weight, which we can see is pretty dramatic over the other two models we built so far. Practicality is still is continuing to go down, so the Luna is the most practical, then the Star dips down a little bit, and then the Constellation dips down still more. For off-road ability, we see a boost in performance with the active comfort spring setup on the premium trims versus the progressive spring setup on the standard trims. And comparing it to the other two models, even with the all-wheel drive, we're not quite reaching the performance we got with the Star, but we are exceeding what we had with the Luna. As far as utility goes, our Constellation is the strongest performer, which isn't too surprising considering that it's a bigger vehicle and it's more capable of hauling loads than our previous two models, which we can see kind of go in that order of being smallest vehicle with the least capacity to carry a load, the medium-sized vehicle with a slightly increased ability to haul a load, and then our largest vehicle with the best ability to haul a load, having the strongest performance. Reliability dips down from the Luna and Star, but considering that we're using higher tech options, for instance, what we get with the premium trims, and we see a drop here with the premium trim and the Star, and also that we're using all-wheel drive systems and other higher tech options that will overall bring down the reliability. And we have never really built the Constellation to be one of our more reliable models. That has always been the strong suit of the Luna and the Asteroid. As far as fuel economy, it's no surprise here that this is not really that much of a strong performer, considering that a lot of these trims are using all-wheel drive, and that this is a much heavier vehicle as well. Definitely we are not getting nearly as good of fuel economy as we are with the other two models, but if we were to compare, for instance, the last time we built a Constellation, the fuel economy numbers we got before, this is definitely a marked improvement, except for our V8 premium trim. Looks like a little bit of a dip from what we had in the past, but otherwise, definitely improvements over previous year periods. As far as weight, we already discussed that this is the heaviest model by a large part. As far as emissions go, This is not one of our strongest performers, but the V6 tends to do pretty well here, as we saw with the Star, but we have a little bit worse emissions. This is slightly set up differently than the base variant of the EV 3.2. So I think because we are having a little bit more power and we're pushing the engine a little bit harder, we have slightly worse emissions than we got with the Star with the same engine. As far as production units, I don't think it's any surprise that this takes the longest to build, as well as costing the most to build as well. In any case, that wraps up the video. I hope you guys have enjoyed. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.